Hello and welcome to Mel Make Stuff. My name is Melissa and this is the third episode in my series about my works in progress in 2024. The last video that I put out, which will be linked below if you haven't seen it yet, is everything that I finished from January to March this year. And so now I'm about to show you what I've finished as far as my works in progress between April and June, and also a couple new things that I started along the way. The first garment that I have to show you today is my green Bohus sweater, which I designed myself. As you'll know if you've watched this channel in the past, I have made a couple of sweaters now out of the Poems of Color book about Bohus sweaters. And so I took that book and I sort of modeled the structure of this yoke as far as where the increases are and that type of thing off of some of the sweaters that I've made from this book previously. I knitted this using entirely yarns that I had in my stash. For example, the yarn that's closest to my neck, the dark green, is a leftover from my Vare sweater that I made a couple of years ago, and just a bunch of different colors that I have in my colorwork yarn stash. And my original intent was to make this sweater in order to practice knitting the body of the sweater on my knitting machine. I knit the yoke by hand from the top down, and then it sat on the needles for quite a while I got up the nerve to try to hang this on the knitting machine in order to knit the rest of the body. The yarn that I used for the main color of the sweater, the light mint green, is a Biches Le Petit Lambswool, and by the time I finally got around to putting it on the machine and started to knit, it was making a really beautiful fabric on the machine because this yarn is just slightly thinner than a normal fingering weight, I find. But that meant it also was a little bit delicate and it kept breaking at the point where it goes through like a feeder hole. Before even getting into the machine, it kept breaking. And so I got frustrated and just put it back on the needles and decided to knit the body by hand. Since it was just stockinette at that point, I took this with me to Knit City, Toronto as my sort of mindless knitting project. I had already been planning to make it cropped and also with a short sleeve like my sister's Boho sweater that I recently finished. And I realized the day before the festival, we were at the Knitting Loft, which by the way is a fantastic yarn store. It's probably the nicest yarn store that I've ever been to in person. If you're ever in Toronto, it's certainly worth a visit. We had gone to the store the day before and we were sitting around chatting and knitting, and I realized that I might actually be able to finish this sweater in order to wear it to the festival the next day. I didn't even end up having to really rush or stay up late or anything like that. I had plenty of time to finish. I did a sewn bind off the next morning in the hotel room and everything, and steamed it with the iron before going to the festival. As you can see, this did end up quite cropped. I think this is the shortest that I would ever really do a cropped sweater. It will show my bra if I raise my arms straight up over my head, but I have a vision of wearing this over like a linen dress. And I don't have one of those yet, but I certainly have the ability to sew one. So that is how I am envisioning wearing this in the future. I'm not planning to put out a pattern for this because I just don't have the bandwidth to do pattern support, honestly, and sort of everything that goes along with releasing a pattern. So maybe sometime in the long distant future, but not anytime soon. So that is my Bohus yoke. So that is the one knitting project that you have seen before, and now I have two new ones that I started and finished. The first one is the Bright Sweater by Junko Okamoto. This pattern came out in 2016, and I feel like this is the pattern that first made me aware of her designs and sort of might have been her first garment pattern that sort of launched her onto the English knitting scene. That's what I remember from back then anyway. This sweater only comes in one size, which I feel is also maybe indicative of it being a little bit older pattern. The finished chest measurement of the sweater is about 55 inches. And the body circumference at the fullest point, according to the pattern, is supposed to be 67 inches. So it says it's one size, but it's shown on a model with like a 34-inch bust. And so, of course, if you want the pattern to fit you the same way as it fits the model and your bust is bigger than 34 inches, you may be able to get away with it for a little while, but then you're going to want to make some modifications potentially to have it fit you in the same way. This pattern is knit top down, and the original yarn called for, which is what I used, is the Moeke Yarns Elena single, which is a toothy sport weight singles yarn, which is sort of interesting. This yarn is significantly different from a superwash merino singles yarn that you might be familiar with. I wouldn't consider this yarn to be soft. It's not scratchy, but it's also not soft. There's a lot of veg matter in it. You can tell it's quite close to like a farm yarn that you might get at a festival. The yarn is slightly overspun, which gives it a little bit of energy, but not so much that it's biasing the fabric in the finished garment, which can sometimes happen when you're knitting with singles yarns. This particular yarn is not being produced anymore, but I think you could easily sub with the Lichen and Lace Rustic Heather Sport, which I also have right here. Or you could use the Briggs and Little Sport, which is, I think, the same yarn as the Lichen and Lace. I believe the Lichen and Lace is spun by Briggs and Little. So you should be able to substitute with either of those two, and those are two different price points as well. I found knitting this to be really enjoyable, but it felt sort of like it had been designed on the needles. Like, not in a bad way, but there were just sort of interesting things going on the whole time that felt very organic. Let me take you over and show you this garment in a flat lay so you can maybe see what I'm talking about. Here is my bright sweater, and you can see already it's got a little bit of an unusual shape. You can see, of course, the body is oversized compared to the sleeve width, and you can also maybe see, and I'll show you this closer in a second, but up at the neck there are short rows to raise the back of the neck. There are short rows actually dispersed throughout the yoke and also on the back of the sweater, which are also creating this almost a shirt tail hem effect. There's the same amount of ribbing on the back as on the front, but the wedge of short rows at the bottom of the body are creating this sort of lowered hem here. So the pattern is knit from the neckline down. You start with this rolled neck and continue on. There are people on Ravelry who have adjusted this neck in various ways. It might be worth a look if you're thinking about making the sweater. We have a couple of different stitch patterns, or these little cluster wrapped stitches, and this big cable, which is sort of the main feature of the yoke. And then we have some interesting shoulder shaping that starts. So up until here, it's sort of a normal circular yoke shape. And then we get some rapid increasing at the very bottom of the circular yoke, along with effectively some raglan increasing that almost makes a saddle shoulder look. Up until this point here, you are knitting in the round. And then at this point, you stop knitting the round, you start knitting back and forth until you get to the bottom of where your sleeve is going to go, and you eventually come back here and pick up these stitches and knit your sleeve down. The interesting body shaping continues at this point, so you end up doing some increases for the back that give you more stitches for the back than on the front. It almost creates a little bit of a cape-like effect when you're wearing it. You can sort of see here is the side seam, so you can tell on both sides, because we do get some decreases here for the body, you end up with more stitches on the back than on the front. It creates a very interesting shape. Just to give you a close-up of this body shaping, what you actually do here is decrease on the front only. And so it really emphasizes that more fabric in the back shape, and that's probably also contributing a little bit to this, this lowered hem here. After you are done with the body, you come back up here, and these stitches had been put on hold, and you pick up stitches around the front and the back of the body, add some for your arm, and then you knit the sleeve down, and that is it. The one modification that I made was to pick up more stitches than recommended as I was picking up these stockinette stitches for the sleeve to start knitting down. And ideally I would have planned ahead and maybe added some rows on the body to accommodate that. I was worried the sleeve was going to be a little bit too tight. I do not like sleeves being too tight. I think for the look of this sweater, it makes sense to have like a slim fitting sleeve. But there's a difference between something that fits closely to the arm and something that's like a sausage casing. And I obviously did not want the latter. So if you are looking to enlarge this sweater for whatever reason, I think your best opportunities are going to be a combination of continuing maybe for some more raglan increases here. I'm just calling these raglan increases, even though they're sort of saddle shoulder increases, but increasing there and also playing with this armhole depth, how many stitches you cast on for your underarm. And also when you get to this point and you're reserving, the pattern calls for you to reserve these stitches on some waist yarn, you might consider reserving some body stitches as well to play with this armhole depth just so it doesn't get too deep. It's going to be really individual, honestly, as far as what proportion you want for your sleeve versus your bust, but that is where I would start. You could also play with adding more stitches here or elsewhere in the yoke, although where this sits, I feel like this will probably fit a lot of folks, as is common for people who have bigger busts doesn't necessarily mean you have a bigger neck or bigger shoulders, right? Sometimes you do and sometimes you don't. And so for a lot of folks, it might actually, fit you up until here or up until here. And then you need to make some other adjustments. And I guess that is the good thing about this being knit top down, is that you can start and then sort of see what you need to do. So you guys know I like to build the airplane while I'm flying it. So that is what I would do if I were trying to size this up. And that is the bright sweater. The last knitting project I have to share with you today is what I'm wearing. It's the Caspar top by Johanna Gehrisch. This pattern is a very simple tank top. It's knitted from the top down using a single strand of silk mohair yarn, and there are a number of increases right above the bust that create a very blousey effect. You might think that texture change just above the bust is created by adding another strand of yarn to sort of create a little bit denser looking fabric, but it's actually done by changing your needle so the gauge changes. You use a significantly bigger needle for the straps and the top portion, the first couple inches of the body. I think it's a 5mm needle. And then at the point where you do all of these rapid increases just above the bust, you change to a smaller needle. I think it's 3.75mm. And at that time, you're doing these really exponential increases that create significantly more fabric for the body of the sweater. The way the pattern is written has you come back to the neckline and the armholes and finish them by picking up the stitches and doing an I-cord bind off at the end. I wanted to limit the finishing on this, so I actually did a slipped stitch I-cord edge as I went, and I didn't add any stitches at the beginning, which has sort of created these smaller straps on my version. The pattern as written has a little bit thicker strap, so you'd have a better chance at like hiding a bra strap underneath there if you do it as written. I did do the neckline as written by picking up the stitches and doing an I-cord bind off. I did not create a loop for a button at the back. I just sewed the top of the keyhole neckline together because I didn't need to button or unbutton it in order to get it on my body. If you're on Ravelry, I would really encourage you to check out the projects in this pattern. Karen, who's a regular viewer, hi Karen, she's a fantastic knitter. I think the name that she uses on Ravelry and possibly on Instagram as well is Casuarina Girl. She is a beautiful knitter, and she has knit this pattern multiple times, and so I referenced some of her project notes for doing this, particularly around the increase, the style of increases that I used. So the pattern as written, as you do these increases at the top of the bust, has them sort of grouped, and then you knit some stitches even and you do a big grouped increase. So they're almost like little tucks. And Karen had mentioned that she changed that so that all of the increases were even, and that is what I did as well. I don't know, I liked the idea of that. I also like the original way they look, and I think it's also beautiful, but this sort of gave a more consistent appearance across that line of increases. So that was one other modification I made other than that slip stitch edge for the armholes. Karen also has a dress version of this, which is fabulous. She has a version that she knitted with a whole bunch of different colored leftovers and then dyed it using Rit dye. So she just had a black top after that. Honestly, fantastic. Really, if you're on Ravelry, go ahead and check her out. The only other modification I made was to shorten the body by 1.5 centimeters, and I did just bind off with a normal bind off in stockinette. You would think that would cause the bottom of this to roll, but it doesn't really, not significantly at any rate. I think you could probably do the same thing with, if you wanted to make this with like a normal linen yarn, if you didn't want something real fuzzy. You could probably also do that bind off as recommended in the pattern without significant rolling. Plant fibers will often allow you to do that in a way that you can't really do with animal fibers quite as well. As far as the styling of this, in the modeled shots that I have, I'm wearing it with like a lacy tank top underneath. This one, I'm just wearing it with a plain tank top. You can see how it really does change the impression of the garment. You could wear it with just a fancy bra if you're going out or something like that. I'm certainly not above doing that, but I don't have any bras that are quite that nice. But maybe I'll go get one. I really enjoyed making this pattern. I will certainly be making another one. I'm actually going to start another one in the near future, so I will show you that very soon. And now I have 2 sewing items for you, so 2 garments to show you. One of them is a previous work in progress, and that is my Wiksten folding jacket. So this pattern is not available anymore, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But as you might recall, I had the pieces cut out for this since at least 2019. I had cut out the size small, which is a very oversized, I mean, it's meant to be a quite oversized garment. I sewed it together as written with no modifications, and I used sort of a heavyweight linen. I'm fairly sure that this colorful one, the main fabric, was meant to maybe be an upholstery fabric. The collar is interfaced on both sides. I'm not sure how necessary that was. It definitely gives it body in the fabric that I chose, but I maybe could have gotten away with only interfacing one side of the collar. I considered shortening the sleeves because I could tell that they were going to be too long, but I figured why not go just fully over the top and leave them long in order to be able to cuff them and just wear it cuffed all the time so that you can see that lining fabric one more time. So that is my finished Wiksten folding jacket. And the last sewing project that I have to share with you today is the Joe dress by Closet Core Patterns. My husband has been in school for the last year to do a career change, and he was graduating at the end of May. So I realized about a month ahead of time that I didn't really have anything appropriate to wear to a graduation at the end of May. You know, like dressing for a graduation that's not your own is a little tricky. Like I don't want to take attention away from the graduates or anything, but I also want to look nice and appropriate for the occasion. So I decided to make a dress. I had been wanting to make the Joe dress since it came out. There was some controversy at the time because it looks to be a dupe of a Mara Hoffman dress that was in production, and you can Google if you want to read more about that particular controversy. My take is that the clientele who are going to buy like a $500 dress are probably not the same as the clientele who want to buy this pattern to make it. So I don't have any misgivings about making this pattern, but to each their own. The fabric that I used for this dress is the Robert Kaufman Brussels washer yarn dye in the Chambray colorway, and I love this stuff. I had had this fabric in my stash for years and years. I can't even remember what I originally bought it for, but it is fantastic. It's a linen rayon blend. I think it's close to half and half. It's like 55 linen, 45% rayon, something like that. And it is fabulous. I am definitely going to buy more. And I really can't believe that it just sat around for so long. It would have been perfect for many of the things that I like to wear, but hey, now I know. I had 3 yards of this in my stash, which turned out to be not quite enough, so I did modify this dress by basically just cutting the bottom off. The dress as drafted at that length would not have looked good on me, honestly. I probably would have made this modification whether I was short on fabric or not. That midi length on a normal height person just always makes me look like I'm dressing up in my mom's clothes. Like I'm 5'2", which is like 158 centimeters or so. And patterns are usually drafted for somebody who's 5'5", 5'6". And so I'm always having to modify for length anyway, and that was an easy modification in this case. As far as the sizing, so my actual body measurements are 35 bust, about a 28 waist, and like a 38 hip. For the pattern, I graded from a size 10 on top, so size 10 at the bust and waist, and then I graded out to a 12 at the hip. These sheath type dresses, especially in the bottom, can be a little tricky on me because I have a booty, and so I was a little bit worried about cutting out the straight size 10, even though I think it would have been okay. I have plenty of room in the hip, but just because I was going to be sitting at the graduation and then attending a party afterward, I didn't want to be all wrinkled if it was too tight and that type of thing. The pattern gives 2 sleeve options, so sort of more and less drama. I, of course, chose the bigger, more drama sleeve, and then you can also choose from a skirt or pants for the bottom to make it a jumpsuit. So I definitely also needed to shorten that skirt to preserve some fabric because all of these style lines around the neck and the top of the sleeve are made using bias tape. So if I had made the dress as drafted with the full length, I would have needed 3.75 yards, and I only had 3. So by shortening the skirt, I was able to get the bias tape out of the rest of the fabric. And I had just enough, honestly. I would have had to really start seaming the bias tape very frequently as I was making it, and that's not ideal. So I think this was fine, but any longer of a skirt and I would have needed more fabric. The other thing that I did was cut all of my pieces single layer instead of on the fold, and so that ended up helping me preserve a lot of that fabric that I needed for the bias tape as well. This was definitely the most advanced thing that I've sewn to date, and I really wanted it to be nice because it was my husband's graduation, so I really took my time with every aspect of making this project, from the cutting to making the bias tape to making sure all of my sewing was very accurate. There were times in this pattern where I didn't know exactly what was happening because of how you have to sew the bias tape on. It's not a normal construction. I really took my time with sewing the whole thing. I think it says something on the pattern about like, take your time and make it in a weekend or something like that. And I took 2 weeks to make it. I really did not rush myself. I like doing just little bites at a time for sewing in general, and especially with something like this. I think the reason that this project is a little more challenging is that you really need to make a lot of your alteration decisions very early on because of the way the seams are finished with the bias tape. It's not as easy as just turning up the hem at the end and, you know, adjusting the length at that point. You really need to make your decisions about how long the skirt's going to be and whether you need to take away or add length to the sleeve very early, like before. I mean, for altering the sleeve length, you would probably want to make that decision on the pattern before you cut your fabric. Because of the unusual shape of the sleeve, if you get to the end and find out that you really need to hem that sleeve shorter, it's going to change the shape of the sleeve. And so you would want to make that adjustment much earlier. The other thing that maybe makes this project a little bit more intermediate level is that there's not a great place to do a mid-project try-on because of the way it's constructed. The skirt isn't closed until the zipper goes in. There's a zipper that goes all the way down the back. And so until that point, the back of the dress is open and it's a little bit hard to really tell how it's fitting. You do construct the bodice first. So after I had the bodice done, other than the closure in the back, obviously, I pinned it on myself. And then at that point, I could see where that waist seam was going to be. And I could have theoretically made adjustments to the skirt length at that point. If it was a little bit too long, I could have hemmed it. There wasn't any way I could add more fabric because I had already cut the fabric by that point. But on me, usually a little bit shorter skirt is better than longer, just proportionally. So I figured it was going to be okay, and luckily it was. It did make it an incredibly magical experience when the zipper went in and I got to try it on for the very first time, and it was like an absolute miracle that it fit the way I wanted it to fit. I know that this sort of very oversized look on the top is not for everyone, but I really liked it. I thought it was elegant, I thought it was appropriate for the situation, and that was exactly what I needed. I did add some bra strap keepers that I made just by crocheting with some sewing thread. Otherwise, I would have been constantly adjusting this. I mean, constantly. It would have been falling off my shoulders for sure. As far as the fabric choice, I think that this was like a bang-on fabric choice for this pattern because you do need something that will hold a nice press. You know, sometimes you get fabrics that don't really want to be ironed, and in this dress, with the way it's constructed and the bias tape and all of that, you'll be just in a world of hurt if your fabric doesn't hold a nice, firm press. So just something to note if you are thinking about making this. I had a Cupro in my stash that I was considering using, and I thank God that I did not, because I would have been absolutely ripping my hair out. The other nice thing about this Robert Kaufman fabric is that it has just enough body to hold the shape of this interesting sleeve, but not so much that it makes it look like a costume, which I think could be the case if you're using a little bit stiffer linen or something like that. So something that has a little bit of body, but a little bit of drape as well, and can be pressed would be nice for this. So I think that's all that I have for you today. I do have the Hypnosis sweater, my Japanese mohair sweater, finished, but I'm going to show that to you in the next video because I've also started another project out of a Japanese book, so I'm going to show those together. I have also been working on my other things, my quilt and my spinning and my other projects, but I'm not sure I'm going to continue this particular like whip check-in series. I'm not sure how much interest the other projects will have really, but one thing that I would like to do and I'd like to ask your help with is I have my cardigan pieces for my Neve sweater finished, and I want to do a video about how I seam like a raglan, knitted flat raglan garment, because I think that's, you know, knitted flat garments are not really the style anymore, and I thought it might be interesting for folks to see how that's done if it's something that you've never done before. And while I'm doing that on camera, I would also like to answer some questions from you all. If you have anything that you would like to ask me, please put it down below. And I'd like to just start collecting questions for a Q&A. If you've watched the video this long, you are obviously one of my very good fans, so thank you so much for watching this long, and I would really love to know what questions you have for me, so they can be about anything. If it's too personal, I just won't answer it, but yeah, please feel free to ask me whatever down below, and I will film that video probably a little bit later on in the summer, beginning of fall. I've been seeing a couple of my friends, Selma and Mega, have both done Q&As recently, and it's very cool to learn more about them than I already do know. You know, we talk all the time, but sometimes it just takes somebody else asking a question for you to learn more about your friend, and I found that to be very nice, so I'd like to do a Q&A as well. So that is all that I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.